You don't put your hands on a child. Thump. The cabin gasped. The boy had just been shoved. 8 years old. Quiet. Bookish. He didn't cry. He just reached for his book, stood up, and quoted the law. 10 minutes later, 42 airports locked Skyfront Airlines out of their systems. $890 million vanished from their ESG-linked accounts. And the woman behind it all? She was already watching the footage before the plane left the gate. Tell us where you're watching from, because what happens next will make you rethink who really holds power in the skies. 5 hours earlier in Upper Arlington, Ohio, the morning started like any other. "Why do you keep reading that book, sweetie?" Alyssa asked, tugging her sweatshirt over her scrubs as she grabbed a protein bar and coffee. Emmanuel sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, flipping through a copy of Federal Aviation Regulations for Passengers with Disabilities. His thumb was pressed against Section 382.117. "Because they break the rules," he said. "And someone has to know when they do." He said it calmly, like he wasn't just 8, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. Columbus International Airport, 7:18 a.m. Boarding for Flight 2612 to New York City had just begun. Delayed 20 minutes. Cabin a little tense. Emmanuel walked beside his mom, backpack tight to his chest, eyes calm. In his hand, the same book. Corners dog-eared. Notes in the margins. Page 44 already marked with a yellow tab. They found their seats. Row 5. Alyssa took the window. Emmanuel sat on the aisle. Next to them, in 5C, was a little girl with a nasal cannula delivering oxygen and a portable ventilator tucked beneath the seat. Her mother was adjusting the straps on the tubing, speaking softly. Then she arrived. Blonde bun. Clipboard. Name tag. K. Murphy. She glanced at the ventilator and made a face. "You'll need to move her to the rear," she told the mother. "Medical devices can't block this section." The woman blinked. "She needs the aisle for airflow. We submitted documentation 3 days ago." "Well," the attendant snapped, "this section is for select passengers. It's not safe." The little girl's eyes flickered with anxiety. Her chest began to rise faster. Then Emmanuel quietly closed his book and stood up. "You're violating Section 382.117, he said. "Passengers with ventilators are protected under the Air Carrier Access Act. You can't force them to move if accommodation was pre-approved." The attendant turned, confused, annoyed. "I'm sorry. What?" Emmanuel held up the open page. "It's here. Look, subsection B. They're allowed assistive devices and access to airflow if documented." Passengers began to look over. 1 or 2 phones raised just slightly. Murphy leaned in. Her voice dropped an octave. "You need to sit down, young man." "I'm just reminding you what's lawful," Emmanuel said. And then she shoved him. It wasn't hard, but it was clear. Her hand hit his shoulder. His book dropped. His back hit the armrest. Several people gasped. The little girl began to cry. Alyssa was up instantly. "Did you just put your hands on my son?" "Ma'am, control yourself," Murphy snapped. "Control myself?" Alyssa's voice shook. "He quoted law, and you assaulted him." But Emmanuel didn't cry. He didn't even move at first. Then he bent down, calmly picked up his book, opened to the same page, and pulled out his phone. 7:25 a.m., Washington, D.C. Patricia Reed answered before the second ring. "Emmanuel?" Her voice was low but firm. "She pushed me. I cited 382.1117. The girl had oxygen." She paused. The silence on her end wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. "All right, baby," she said quietly. "Grandma's got this. Stay seated." 7:29 a.m., Cabin 5. The attendant tried to smooth things over. "No harm done," she muttered. But passengers were already whispering. Someone live-streamed quietly behind sunglasses. Emmanuel's face was neutral, but his posture had changed. More centered. Focused. The mother of the disabled girl leaned across. "Thank you," she mouthed. Alyssa wrapped an arm around her son. Her fingers were shaking. 7:32 a.m., Washington, D.C. Patricia sat at her encrypted terminal, logged into the ClearEquity score, TM, Ethics Gateway. She bypassed the dashboards, typed her override code. Skyfront Airlines, ESG tier, active. Initiate ClearEquity strike? She clicked yes. The screen blinked. Are you sure? Confirm suspension of 42-node ethical access and 890M ESG-linked capital. She pressed confirm. Within 90 seconds, 42 major airports issued non-compliant alerts. $890 million in ESG funds were frozen. Skyfront's clearance to board from any federally supported terminal was suspended. FAA Ethics Division triggered an automatic review. Multiple media channels picked up the alert from public watchdog servers. The plane hadn't even pushed back, but Skyfront was already grounded, in ways they couldn't fix with apologies. Back in 5B, Emmanuel watched the girl across the aisle giggle faintly as her mom wiped her nose. Alyssa exhaled deeply, still watching the flight attendant pace, confused. Emmanuel didn't smile. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "It's not just about knowing the law." He looked down at the book again. It's about making them remember it. It took less than 5 minutes for the cabin to split. Some passengers whispered quietly, pulling phones out only when the flight attendants weren't looking. Others shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to speak up or stay quiet. But Emmanuel? He was still. Not frozen, focused. He had seen this type of silence before. The kind where adults pretend nothing's wrong to protect themselves, where truth bends under procedure and wrongness is hidden behind soft voices and fake smiles. Alyssa didn't sit. Her jaw was clenched. Her hands were shaking slightly, one from fear, one from rage. She leaned toward Murphy, whose tone had suddenly turned syrupy. "That wasn't a shove," Murphy lied, louder now. "He just lost his balance." "You think I didn't see it?" Alyssa snapped. "You assaulted my child!" "Ma'am, please lower your voice." "Oh, now you care about tone?" Alyssa's voice cracked. "You put your hands on my son. You silenced a legal correction. And now you want calm?" The other flight attendant, shorter with a pixie cut and apologetic energy, hurried down the aisle. "We need to de-escalate." "Ma'am, please. Are you the head flight attendant?" Alyssa cut in. The woman hesitated. "No, that would be—" "I want her removed," Alyssa said, "before this plane moves." The pixie-cut attendant didn't answer. Emmanuel stayed quiet, but his fingers tapped lightly against the page he had been reading. His eyes never left Murphy. Across the aisle, the little girl, still holding her oxygen, peeked out from under her hoodie. Her mom mouthed silently to Alyssa, "Thank you." Alyssa nodded, trying to calm herself. But inside, she was counting. Heartbeats, seconds, breaths. She was thinking like a nurse. Then she heard it, the buzz of an intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pilot announced, "we've been advised of a brief hold from the tower. Please remain seated as we complete final checks." Lies. There was no tower hold. Alyssa knew what was happening. Someone had called it in. Her son had made a call, and someone was listening. In Washington, D.C., Patricia Reed's office lights had barely flickered when a flood of email pings hit the National Compliance Network. ClearEquity's override protocol had not only triggered airport alerts, it had bounced directly to the FAA's Ethics Division. By the time Patricia clicked into the incident report, the entire video had already uploaded from 4 separate live streams, and one of them included her grandson. Standing up, citing regulation, getting shoved. Her heart didn't pound, her breath didn't speed, but something colder settled beneath her sternum. She tapped into the internal incident system. A red triangle blinked. Flight 2612. Status: hold. Incident: unreviewed. She flagged it priority emergency and forwarded it to both FAA legal and civil rights enforcement. Then she sat back in her chair. She hadn't even had coffee yet. On board Flight 2612, the murmurs had grown louder. Murphy was now pacing near the cockpit, trying to appear busy. Passengers whispered. Some had seen the shove. Some only heard about it. Did the kid really quote the law? Yeah, something about Section 382. That's insane. I saw the flight attendant push him. No joke. The girl with the oxygen had now curled up in her seat, her mother's arms gently around her. Meanwhile, the pixie-cut flight attendant returned, eyes darting between Alyssa and Murphy. We're waiting on clarification from ground operations, she said. They want to verify passenger manifest and something about the, compliance systems. You mean they want to verify if you just laid hands on a child? Alyssa said coolly. Her voice wasn't raised anymore. It was just cold. Because I promise you, someone important is watching. Emmanuel finally spoke again, quietly. I think Grandma flagged them already. Alyssa turned. You called her? Emmanuel nodded. She answered fast. Alyssa exhaled. Of course she did. He flipped his book back to the original page. Section 382.117. No air carrier may deny transportation to any qualified individual on the basis of a disability or relocate such passengers solely due to the presence of medical equipment unless... He stopped. Murphy had returned, and this time she looked pale. I just received a message from Ground Ops, she said, voice clipped. You'll be moved to a different flight, she told Alyssa. Alyssa raised her eyebrow. Excuse me? We're reassigning you. A different aircraft is... You're trying to remove us? Alyssa interrupted. After you shoved my son? Ma'am, don't ma'am me, Alyssa snapped. Let me be perfectly clear. We're not going anywhere. Murphy's jaw clenched. Security will be boarding soon. That's when the cabin door opened. Not security. 3 people in navy jackets. FAA insignia. The cabin silenced. Murphy turned pale again. The lead officer stepped forward and said something no one expected. We'd like to speak with the crew. All of them. Now. Murphy froze. Alyssa folded her arms. Emmanuel looked up, blinking once. Is that the federal ethics officer? It was. 20 minutes later, Murphy and the rest of the crew were escorted off the aircraft. Passengers remained on board. Phones were everywhere. One video already had 120,000 views. The ethics officer stood at the front of the cabin and addressed everyone. We apologize for the disruption. The FAA is investigating this flight due to a reported ethics violation concerning a minor passenger. Heads turned toward Emmanuel. He didn't smile. He simply closed his book. Meanwhile, across the country, something deeper had begun. Patricia wasn't just a regulator. She was the founder of ClearEquity, the system that granted airlines their ESG scores, scores that tied directly to $890 million in federal investment funds. And Skyfront had just breached the passenger integrity clause. Within 2 hours, ESG funds froze across 6 partner banks. 42 airports removed Skyfront's fast-track boarding priority. Airline rating agencies flagged the brand non-compliant. Investors paused 3 ongoing capital expansion projects. 2 news anchors opened with the headline, 8-year-old boy cites federal law, gets assaulted by airline, then brings industry to its knees. Back in the cabin, the new crew finally boarded. The mood was different, softer, apologetic. One attendant kneeled in front of Emmanuel and said, We're sorry. You were right. That shouldn't have happened. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply said, It's not about being right. It's about being ethical. Later that night, as they landed in New York, the airline issued a public statement. Vague, sanitized. But Patricia wasn't done. She logged into the ClearEquity board portal and scheduled a hearing. Agenda: proposal to enforce mandatory passenger ethics certification for all crew operating under ESG-linked contracts. And just before closing her laptop, she added one note. Inspired by Emmanuel Reed, age 8. The morning news exploded before the plane even landed. It wasn't just a story about an 8-year-old being pushed. It was about power, rules. Who's allowed to speak up, and what happens when they do. By the time Flight 2612 touched down at LaGuardia, 5 news outlets had already clipped the video. MSNBC, CBS, even a few law TikTok accounts. The video was simple: a boy standing with a book in hand, calmly stating federal code. Then a flight attendant pushes him. Then silence. Then fallout. The title varied depending on the platform. Kid lawyer gets justice in the sky. Boy, 8, knows the law better than the airline. Flight attendant assaults child. Didn't know who his grandma was. By mid-afternoon, the hashtags #Emmanuel Reed and #382111 were trending. But Emmanuel wasn't reading headlines. He was sitting in a quiet lounge at the airport, sipping apple juice and rereading Chapter 6 of his aviation law book. Next to him, Alyssa sat quietly, staring at her phone. "They just posted it on The View," she murmured. Emmanuel looked up. "I don't want to be famous," he said. "I know, baby. I just wanted her to stop." Alyssa reached over and ran a hand over his head. "She will." Meanwhile, across the country, corporate panic was rising. Skyfront Airlines' legal team scrambled to control the damage, but Patricia Reed's move had already set off a chain reaction. When she activated the ClearEquity override, the system did more than freeze ESG funds. It triggered mandatory audits across every connected terminal and partner airport. That meant 42 airports had to rerun compliance reports, 17 vendors paused collaboration, and every Skyfront staff member linked to the flight was now under review. What made it worse? The override was public, and Patricia's name was attached. At the FAA headquarters in DC, a special task force had already been called. "Flight 2612 has exposed a structural gap," one officer said, pointing to the compliance dashboard. "Most staff aren't even trained in the Air Carrier Access Act. And now we're on the hook to explain why," another muttered. That's when Patricia entered the room. No announcement, no entourage, just her, holding a printout of a still frame image. Emmanuel, standing in the aisle, book raised, eyes steady. She handed it to the table. "This is the face of ethics," she said, "and we're going to build around it." At the same time, across a quiet family kitchen in Upper Arlington, Ohio, Emmanuel's grandfather had just come in from the garden. "Have you seen this?" he asked, placing the iPad on the table. "You're everywhere, kiddo." Emmanuel looked up from his flashcards. "I didn't mean to be." "You didn't try to be," the old man corrected. "There's a difference." He smiled gently. "You did something hard. You stood up for someone else. That's what changes systems." Alyssa turned from the sink. "You think they'll actually change anything?" "They already are," her father said. "You just don't see it yet." By late afternoon, Skyfront's stock had dropped 7%. 3 ESG fund managers issued temporary blacklisting notices. A joint statement from the Disability Justice Alliance and the Ethics in Aviation Foundation released a formal demand. "We call on Skyfront Airlines to immediately suspend all staff involved, issue a full public apology, and adopt the Passenger Dignity Protocol authored by ClearEquity Chair Patricia Reed." And then came the bombshell. Patricia released a public statement broadcast live. What happened on Flight 2612 wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a systemic failure. When an 8-year-old child understands federal law better than the trained crew meant to uphold it, then it is not the child who must be corrected. It is the system. Today, ClearEquity has frozen $890 million in ESG-linked funding, suspended access at 42 airports, and triggered an industry-wide ethics audit. My name is Patricia Reed. That boy is my grandson, and this will never happen again. Emmanuel watched it all in silence. He sat beside his mother at the hotel, still in the clothes he wore that morning. The screen glowed in front of them. "That last line," Alyssa whispered. "She meant it." "She always means it," Emmanuel said. He didn't look proud, just tired. "Are we going home?" "Soon," she said. "I miss my room." She laughed softly. "I miss normal." Then quietly, "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Emmanuel nodded. but didn't respond right away. Then he turned to her. "I didn't do it for me, Mom." "I know. I did it for the girl." She was scared, and her mom looked like no one was listening. Alyssa nodded slowly. That's how real change starts. The next morning, news broke that Skyfront's CEO had been summoned by the Transportation Ethics Council. The topic: compliance violations, ESG funding misuse, and a proposal to adopt the newly drafted Passenger Ethics Certification Protocol. Patricia had already named the first test case, Skyfront. Meanwhile, schools across the country began sharing the clip of Emmanuel in civics classes. One teacher in Atlanta asked her students, "If an 8-year-old can do that, what's stopping you?" And in a quiet corner of the airport terminal, a woman in a dark blazer approached Emmanuel and Alyssa. "Hi," she said gently. "I just wanted to say thank you." "Were you on the flight?" Alyssa asked. "No, but I work in compliance," the woman replied. "And because of your son, we're rewriting our training materials." She crouched down to Emmanuel's eye level. "You reminded grown-ups that we don't just follow rules because they're written. We follow them because they're right." Emmanuel looked at her, head tilted slightly. "What's your job?" "I lead ethics training for East Coast Air." Or, "I did. We're rebuilding it now." He smiled just faintly. "Good. You should add 382.117 Sibin on the first page." By evening, Emmanuel and his mom finally boarded a new flight home. No drama, no incident. But before they took off, the new flight attendant, young, nervous, but sincere, stopped beside them. She looked at Emmanuel. "Hey," she said, "I saw your video." "Oh," he replied, unsure what to say. "I just wanted to say, you taught me something, and we're learning, all of us." Emmanuel blinked. "Okay." The attendant leaned down. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think someday you're going to be the one writing the laws." He looked out the window, then back at her. "I think I already started." Emmanuel didn't understand why the gate agents were whispering. He and his mom had returned to the airport the next morning to retrieve their luggage, which, like their peace, had been delayed. But the way the staff looked at them felt different now. Before, people looked through them. Now, they were looking at them. "I think they recognize you," Alyssa murmured, trying to keep her voice light as they reached the baggage counter. "I don't want them to," Emmanuel replied, gripping her hand a little tighter. He wasn't wearing anything special, just his usual hoodie, jeans, and a tired look in his eyes. But one of the airline supervisors came over with a nervous smile. "Ms. Reed?" she asked quietly. I just wanted to say we're really sorry about what happened. We're reviewing everything." Alyssa gave her a cool nod. "Appreciate that." The woman lowered her voice. "Just so you know, your son's being referred to as the spark inside Skyfront right now." Emmanuel blinked. "Spark of what?" The woman gave a thin smile. "Change, or chaos. Depends on who you ask." That same morning, in a glass-walled boardroom 50 floors above downtown Manhattan, Skyfront's executive team was unraveling. "Why wasn't this flagged earlier?" one VP demanded, slamming a palm on the table. "Because ClearEquity didn't just flag us," the legal chief snapped. "They nuked our ethical compliance status." The room fell quiet. On the screen behind them was a frozen image. Emmanuel, standing with his book. The one Patricia Reed had used during her public address. "This child," the COO muttered, "has become a national symbol, and the longer we drag our feet, the worse we look." "So what's the plan?" The CEO, silent until now, finally leaned forward. "We fly to DC," she said. "We meet the Reed family. We ask them what they want." A beat passed, "And we pray they don't want our heads." Back in Ohio, Emmanuel sat cross-legged in his room, surrounded by books and cards. Not from family, but from strangers. There were letters from teachers, parents, even a former pilot. One read, "My son has autism. The way you spoke up gave me courage. I showed him your video. We cried together." Another said, "I work in airline training. We've never been forced to review disability protocols until now. Thank you." Emmanuel looked up at his mom. "I didn't know people would care this much." "They do," Alyssa said, "because you stood up when others stayed quiet." He looked back down. "But the lady who got pushed, no one's talking about her." Alyssa's eyes softened. "They will. You reminded the world that people like her matter." Meanwhile, Patricia wasn't just sitting at home. She was on the phone with 3 senators, then the FAA, then a United Nations ethics advisor. The clip of Emmanuel had gone global, and Patricia knew the momentum couldn't be wasted. She sent a memo that afternoon titled, "The Passenger Ethics Enforcement Framework, a 7-day mandate." Inside it were 4 core demands: mandatory real-time training on passenger rights across all U.S. carriers, integration of the ClearEquity score as an ESG requirement, public-facing dashboards on airline ethical scores, immediate reinstatement and protection of whistleblowers. Within 2 hours, 29 advocacy groups co-signed. By that night, the FAA released a statement. "We are in active review with Dr. Patricia Reed regarding a national enforcement protocol to prevent further ethical violations across air transport sectors." While the adults scrambled in boardrooms and government offices, Emmanuel returned to school, and that's when things got weird. Some classmates clapped when he walked in. One asked if he was going to be on Ellen. Another called him Law Boy. He didn't know how to feel. During lunch, a quiet girl named Maria sat across from him. "My cousin saw your video," she said. "He doesn't talk much, but he watched it like 5 times. Emmanuel nodded. "People are acting like I'm famous," he said. "But I just quoted a rule." Maria shrugged. "Yeah, but nobody else did." He looked at her. "Would you have?" She hesitated. "No, I would have been scared." Emmanuel nodded. "Me too. I was scared. I just didn't want to show it." Maria looked at him for a long moment, then pulled out a small card and passed it across the table. "What's this?" he asked. "A thank you, from me and my cousin." On the front, in shaky blue ink, were the words, "For reminding the world to listen when kids speak." By the end of the week, Skyfront publicly announced the suspension of 3 flight attendants, including the one who had pushed Emmanuel. But it wasn't enough. The pressure kept mounting. A former employee came forward, alleging a culture of silencing complaints. Another whistleblower shared that disability training had been reduced to a 10-minute online module. News outlets pounced, and when a former FAA advisor appeared on national television saying, "If a child understands ethical law better than the crew has failed, not the child," Skyfront knew they were losing control of the narrative. That night, Patricia invited Alyssa and Emmanuel to a private dinner. The table was quiet at first. Then Patricia pulled out a simple envelope and slid it to her grandson. Inside, a certificate of appreciation from the Ethics Commission. "It's just paper," Patricia said. "But someday, it'll be a chapter in a book someone else reads." Emmanuel turned the paper over in his hands. "I don't know if I want to be in books." "You're already in one," Alyssa said with a soft laugh. "I just wanted to make things right." Patricia nodded. "And you did, but we're not done yet." She leaned in. "They want to meet, the Skyfront board. They're asking what it would take to end the audit freeze." Emmanuel looked unsure. "You want me to go? I want you to decide." The next day, they flew to DC, not as passengers, as negotiators. Emmanuel didn't wear a suit, just a clean button-down, his favorite sneakers, and the same quiet focus he had on the plane. He entered the room holding nothing but a copy of the Air Carrier Access Act and his notebook. The CEO extended a hand. He shook it politely. Then he said, "You don't fix this by hiding it. You fix it by changing how people are trained, how they think, and how they're held accountable." Silence. Then the CEO asked gently, "And what would you want?" He looked up at her and said simply, "I want what happened to me to never happen again." And in that moment, the most powerful people in the airline felt very, very small. The conference room was larger than any classroom Emmanuel had ever been in, but it felt colder too. Despite the sunlight pouring through the tall windows of the Skyfront DC headquarters, the mood inside was anything but warm. Emmanuel sat at one end of the polished table beside Patricia and Alyssa. Across from them sat the full Skyfront board. 9 people, all dressed in power suits, faces neutral but clearly tense. No one knew exactly how this would go. Not the media waiting outside, not the government observers watching quietly from the corner, and certainly not the executives whose reputations hung in the balance. Patricia began. "We're not here for apologies," she said. "We're here for a plan." The Skyfront CEO nodded slowly. "That's why we invited you." She looked toward Emmanuel. "Your voice has changed everything." He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the attention, but said nothing. Patricia tapped her pen once, calmly. "We've reviewed the numbers. 42 airports have flagged your airline as non-compliant under ClearEquity's ethical access criteria. That status must be reversed before your operations can return to full capacity." One board member cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Dr. Reed, we're willing to do anything, but you haven't told us what you want." Patricia folded her hands. "I didn't come to dictate. I came so he could tell you." The room turned to Emmanuel. He took a breath. "I want a new rule," he said. "Something that says you can't hurt people and get away with it. Something real. That can't be ignored." The CEO leaned in. "What kind of rule?" Emmanuel opened his notebook and read aloud. "All airline personnel must undergo quarterly ethical training, certified by a third-party agency. Each incident involving minors, disabled passengers, or language-based complaints must be reviewed by a federal ethics panel, and every airline must publicly post their updated compliance scores on a site where regular people can read them." A stunned silence. Then someone at the end of the table said quietly, "That's ambitious." Patricia smiled slightly. "It's necessary." Later that afternoon, back at their hotel, Patricia received a call. "The FAA just announced it's adopting the Passenger Ethics Enforcement Framework," the voice on the line said. "Nationwide." Patricia's breath caught, but she didn't show it. "They're calling it the Reed Protocol, ma'am. Effective immediately." Alyssa, sitting nearby, looked up as Patricia hung up. "What is it?" Patricia smiled, just a little. They listened. That evening, Emmanuel stood in front of a group of reporters for the first time. The FAA had invited him, along with his mom and grandmother, to speak briefly following the adoption of the new law. He didn't have a speech, just his notebook. "I didn't want to be part of a story," he began, voice a little shaky. "But I guess I am now." A few people chuckled gently. "I just wanted to sit with my mom. That's it." He paused. "And when they told me I didn't belong up there, I remembered what my grandma taught me. That rules only work when they're fair, and people only follow them when they feel seen." He looked out across the room. "I'm glad they see us now." The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere. And Emmanuel didn't need noise to feel the shift. He could sense it. Over the next 3 days, airline executives scrambled to catch up with the new standards. Several carriers released emergency press statements pledging cooperation with the Reed Protocol. One international airline announced it had already begun retraining flight crews based on the ClearEquity compliance model. But not everyone was happy. A viral op-ed titled, "When Did an 8-Year-Old Become the FAA's Moral Compass?" tried to stir backlash. It failed, because Emmanuel wasn't just a symbol anymore. He was a movement. The hashtag #HatReedProtocol had trended for 72 hours straight. Educators were requesting permission to show his FAA speech in classrooms. A viral TikTok challenge had begun, kids reciting a passenger rights pledge based on Emmanuel's speech. Alyssa watched it all unfold with a mix of awe and quiet concern. He was still just a boy. He still had math homework. That weekend, the family flew home. Not commercial, but via a small FAA chartered jet. Emmanuel sat by the window, watching the clouds. "What are you thinking?" Alyssa asked gently. He shrugged. Just everything. Patricia smiled. Welcome to the world of changemakers. He turned to them. Did I do the right thing? They both answered at once. You did. He looked back outside. I'm glad. But I hope next time it doesn't have to be me. A beat passed. Patricia nodded. That's the point, baby. So it doesn't have to be. At school the next Monday, things had shifted. Teachers treated him like a little more than a student, but not in a bad way. One even asked him to help co-design a school-wide ethics week. During recess, a first grader approached him timidly. You're the law boy, right? Emmanuel sighed. Yeah, I guess. My brother has a wheelchair. Thanks for what you did. He smiled, then knelt down and asked, You want to learn one of the rules I read on the plane? The boy's eyes lit up. Yeah. He opened his notebook again and began to teach. Meanwhile, at a Senate Ethics Committee hearing, Patricia took the stand. She wore a deep navy blazer, her signature white streak in her hair tied back. No jewelry, just conviction. Ms. Reed, a senator began, do you believe this law would have passed without your grandson's incident? Patricia looked him in the eye. No, and it shouldn't have taken that. Murmurs in the gallery. She continued, but now that it's here, we don't let up. We embed it, we expand it, we make it federal law, because dignity is not an upgrade. It's a basic boarding requirement. Applause broke out, even in the chambers. 3 months later, Skyfront Airlines released a promotional video announcing the full implementation of the Reed Protocol. Their new tagline? Every seat, every passenger, equal worth. And at the very end of the video, a quiet message faded onto the screen. Inspired by Emmanuel Reed, age 8. It had been exactly 30 days since Flight 3821117, 1 month since the flight attendant's hand struck Emmanuel Reed, and 30 days since the world realized what an 8-year-old boy could trigger with just the truth and a notebook. But now, the real work was just beginning. The FAA had issued its mandate. Airlines were adapting. Headlines were finally moving on. But Patricia knew better. She sat at her kitchen table in their quiet suburb outside of Charlotte, a fresh pot of tea in front of her, and pages of drafted legislation fanned out like wings. The fight was not over. If anything, now was the most vulnerable stage, when people assumed things had already changed. Down the hall, Emmanuel sat at his desk, a sticky note on the wall above it. Know the law, then teach it. Alyssa peeked into the room, holding a letter. This just came in, she said. From DC? He looked up. Another award? Nope, she smirked. An invitation. The White House. They wanted Emmanuel to speak at the National Youth Integrity Summit. Emmanuel blinked. Me? Alyssa nodded. They said no one else could carry that message better. He turned the letter over, rereading it. I just said what was right. I didn't mean to be a speaker. You meant to be heard, Patricia said, walking in. And you were. 2 weeks later, Washington, D.C. again. The crowd in the East Room was younger this time. Students, teachers, youth leaders, teenage lawmakers in training. Emmanuel stood at the podium, too short to reach the mic without the block they slid underneath him. He smiled nervously. I'm not a politician, he began. I'm just a kid who read the rules. Soft laughter. And I guess I learned that when grown-ups forget to follow them, sometimes kids have to remind them. The audience leaned in. I don't think I'm special, but I think telling the truth is. Backstage, a tall woman approached Patricia. She was sharp-eyed, early 50s, and wore a badge that said only, Federal Transit Ethics Council, Director. I want to talk about expanding your grandson's framework, she said. Patricia raised an eyebrow. We want it across all major transportation sectors, trains, buses, ports, even border customs. Patricia exhaled slowly. That's not a small ask. The woman nodded. But it's the right one. The next month was a whirlwind. Patricia was called in to consult on transportation ethics policy. Alyssa returned to work part-time. Her firm had offered her a special role on corporate compliance and advocacy. And Emmanuel, he tried to stay normal. He still played Minecraft, still hated math drills, still loved grilled cheese. But something had shifted. The kids at school no longer asked, "What happened on the plane?" Now they asked, "How did you know what to say?" He didn't have an easy answer, because the truth was, he didn't. He just remembered what his mom and grandma had always told him. You don't have to be loud, you just have to be clear. Then came the call from Skyfront. This time, not an apology, but a proposition. We're designing an internal ethics training curriculum. We'd like to name the youth component after Emmanuel. Patricia narrowed her eyes. This isn't branding. This is legacy. We know. That's why we're offering full oversight. You and Emmanuel would both be involved. She turned to Emmanuel, who had been quietly listening. He simply asked, "Will it help other kids?" "Yes," they replied. He looked at his grandma. "Then say yes." By winter, the Reed Youth Ethics Initiative was piloted in 5 major cities. Middle schools incorporated it into civic studies. Teens submitted case studies based on real incidents. Kids who had never imagined speaking up started holding mock hearings in school gyms. One 6th grader wrote, "I thought grown-ups always got to decide the rules, but now I know we get to ask why." Emmanuel read that letter twice. He didn't cry, but he held it for a long time. That Christmas, the Reed family finally got a moment of peace. No cameras, no flights, no hearings, just cocoa, blankets, and quiet. Emmanuel looked up from his book and asked, "Do you think this is over?" Patricia, knitting beside the fireplace, said, "Justice doesn't end. It just grows." He nodded. "Then I hope it grows everywhere." On the last day of the year, Alyssa got a phone call from a reporter. "We're doing a feature," she said, "on people who reshaped America in 12 months. Your son's on the list." Alyssa smiled. "He'd probably rather be in the Minecraft top 10. "Too late," the reporter laughed. "He's already bigger than the Ender Dragon." Emmanuel spent New Year's Eve writing one last thing in his notebook. The rules are only the beginning. The real change is making sure people follow them when no one's watching. He closed the notebook and looked out the window. Fireworks lit the sky. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt ready for whatever came next. It was a quiet Saturday morning when the first letter arrived. Not an email, not a text. An actual letter. Thick envelope, cream-colored paper, handwritten return address. Emmanuel was in the living room building a Lego courthouse when Alyssa handed it to him. "Looks important," she said, raising an eyebrow. He tore it open, expecting another thank you, but the first line made him freeze. "My name is Carter. I'm 9. I saw what happened to you. It happened to me too." Patricia looked up from the dining table where she'd been marking a draft of the National Ethics Training Module. "What is it?" she asked gently. Emmanuel didn't answer right away. He read the letter twice, then passed it silently to his grandma. That single letter turned out to be the first of over 200. They arrived over the course of 3 weeks, from children across the country. Some were handwritten, some typed on library computers, a few decorated with crayon or glitter glue. Each told a different story, but with the same theme. A boy in Seattle, pushed by TSA because his autism made him hesitate during boarding. A girl in Miami, told to speak English only when she spoke Spanish to her mother at the gate. A child in rural Texas, denied pre-boarding despite traveling with an oxygen pack. Patricia read every one, and she wept more than once. Emmanuel asked one night, "Why do they keep writing to me?" Alyssa sat beside him on the couch. "Because they trust you." "I'm just a kid." "Exactly. And you told the truth when it mattered. That's more than most adults do." He stared at the latest envelope in his hand. "Then maybe we need to write back." The idea came fast. A video. Not a statement. Not a press conference. Just Emmanuel, sitting on a stool, speaking directly to the kids who'd written to him. They recorded it in one take. "I read your letters," he said. "Every single one. And I just want to say, I believe you." He looked directly into the camera. "You're not invisible. You're not making it up. And you're not alone." Then he added, "We're starting something new, a way for you to tell your story, and change the rules. That something new became the Youth Equity Platform, a website created by Patricia, Alyssa, and a coalition of pro bono developers and civil rights groups. It allowed minors and parents to submit reports of mistreatment, anonymously or publicly, and track how airlines responded. It also featured downloadable kid rights cards with basic language protections, passenger rights in simple terms, and direct FAA hotline numbers. The site crashed within the first 72 hours from traffic overload. But the bigger shock came 10 days later. Skyfront's legal team sent a cease and desist letter. Their claim? The use of airline-specific case references and phrases may imply regulatory authority the Reed family does not possess. Translation: they were scared. Patricia didn't flinch. She called their bluff and went on CNN. Skyfront tried to silence the child they assaulted. Now they want to silence every other child who dares to speak up. I don't think so. The story exploded. Public sympathy, already high, turned tidal. By the end of the week, 3 major airlines had issued public support for the Youth Equity Platform, and one had dropped Skyfront from their airport alliance. Meanwhile, Emmanuel faced a different challenge. Back at school, a new kid had joined the class. Jonas, older, taller, and loud. During recess, Jonas sneered, "Oh, it's the rules, boy. You think you're better than us now?" Emmanuel blinked. "No, I think we all should be treated better." Jonas shoved past him. Later that day, Emmanuel sat alone in the library. He wasn't hurt, but he was tired. Patricia found him there after school, head on his arms. "You okay, baby?" "I just wanted things to be fair. I didn't want to be a mascot." She sat beside him. "You're not a mascot. You're a mirror. You showed the world what it really looked like." He looked up. "Then why do I feel so heavy?" Patricia gently pulled him into her arms. Because change always weighs more than silence. 1 week later, the White House called again, this time with a new ask. Would Emmanuel be willing to co-write the first National Passenger Youth Protection Act to be introduced in Congress? Emmanuel frowned. "What if they change it? What if they ruin it?" Alyssa answered, "Then you testify. You make it hard for them to ignore." And he did. For the first time ever, an 8-year-old child sat before a joint ethics subcommittee of the U.S. Senate and read from his own draft. He said, "If kids are old enough to be harmed on flights, then they're old enough to be protected by the law." Even hardened politicians blinked back emotion. One congresswoman whispered to another, "This kid's going to change more than aviation." The bill passed committee stage with bipartisan support. National newspapers ran stories like, "From Passenger to Pioneer, How One Boy is Redefining Travel Rights." And on TikTok, the hashtag #HatRulesBoy transformed from an insult into a badge of pride. Kids all over the country stitched their own stories into his speech, captioning them, "This happened to me too, but now I know what to say." But not everything was hopeful. Late one night, Patricia found Emmanuel curled up in bed, tears in his eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "I read one more letter," he whispered. "A girl from Ohio. She said her mom got kicked off a flight for breastfeeding, and the crew laughed at her. What if I can't help everyone?" Patricia smoothed his hair back. "You won't." He looked up, startled. "You can't fix the world alone, Emmanuel. But you've made it easier for the next child to speak." He took a shaky breath. "And sometimes, that's all the world needs." By the end of the year, the Youth Equity Platform had logged over 28,000 entries. 25 airlines had signed on to an independent third-party audit program developed by ClearEquity, and Emmanuel's name had quietly been added to a Nobel Peace Prize shortlist in the category of youth advocacy. But none of that was what stuck with him. What stuck was a postcard, taped to his mirror. It read, in crayon, "Thank you for making the plane a place where I don't have to be afraid anymore. Carter." And under that, Emmanuel wrote a single line in pencil. "That's why we started." The email came at 3:17 a.m. Patricia woke up without knowing why. Just a sudden chill across her shoulder. She reached for her phone, half asleep, and blinked at the subject line. Request for emergency clearance review. ClearEquity certification at risk. She sat up. It wasn't from a parent, or even a lawyer. It was from the FAA itself. At 6:00 a.m., the house was already lit. Emmanuel sat at the table with a bowl of cereal, flipping through a new ethics report in his pajama shirt. Patricia had just brewed her second pot of coffee. Alyssa was pacing, phone to her ear, in full corporate mode. "Let me say it again," she snapped into the phone. "Your airline is attempting to challenge a federal ethics protocol written in response to your own misconduct. That's not a legal strategy. That's a tantrum with a lawyer." She ended the call and turned to Patricia. "They're trying to claim Emmanuel's testimony was coached, that he couldn't have understood the laws he quoted." Patricia's jaw tightened. "That's their play? Discredit the child they assaulted?" "They're scared, Pat. You know what that means." Patricia nodded slowly. "It means we're winning." By noon, 3 more airlines had filed notices to pause their cooperation with the youth equity platform, citing internal review processes. One of them had been in quiet talks with Patricia for weeks. Now, they were backpedaling. But then something unexpected happened. An internal Skyfront memo leaked. Not to a news outlet, to a group of flight attendants. And one of them, a woman named Sophia, sent it straight to Emmanuel. He read it twice, then walked into the kitchen, pale. "Grandma," he said, "you need to see this." The memo was simple. Effective immediately, crew are advised to minimize interaction with minors traveling alone or with non-English-speaking guardians. Flag non-compliant passengers early. Avoid legal exposure. It was signed by Skyfront's head of legal risk management. Patricia's hand trembled. "They're institutionalizing discrimination." Alyssa said nothing. She was already dialing. That night, the memo went public. And so did Sophia, the whistleblower flight attendant who had secretly been following Emmanuel's story for months. She gave a live interview, citing internal pressure to move faster on risk groups, and confessed she had once been disciplined for advocating for a disabled child. "I've flown for 19 years, Sophia said. But this broke me. Overnight, the story ignited again. Skyfront memo trended across platforms. Celebrities reposted it. A senator released a statement calling for a full federal ethics audit. And a well-known airline CEO, anonymous on burner Twitter, retweeted with one word, "Disgusting." But inside the house on Rose Hill Street, it wasn't celebration. It was tension. Emmanuel stood at the window, silent. Patricia approached. "You okay?" He shrugged. "I keep thinking about Sophia. She's brave. I know. But what if she gets fired? What if they come after her like they tried with us?" Patricia rested a hand on his shoulder. "Then we stand with her. Together." He nodded slowly, then whispered, "I want to write something." The next morning, a new blog post appeared on the youth equity platform, titled, "To the adults who are scared to do what's right." It read, "You keep asking, why is a kid doing this? Why is a child speaking at Congress or starting websites or reading legal documents? But maybe the real question is, why aren't you? You had jobs, power, voice, and you didn't use it. So don't be surprised when kids like me stop waiting. We're not asking anymore. We're rewriting the rules." The post went viral again, but this time it triggered something different. Within 48 hours, 12 major airport directors issued a joint statement. "As public gatekeepers, we cannot permit discriminatory standards to continue within our terminals. We will suspend operations with any airline failing to meet the ClearEquity certification baseline, effective immediately." Skyfront, still under review, didn't meet that threshold. By the next morning, 42 airports had pulled their partnerships. Flights were grounded, operations scrambled, and inside Skyfront's Atlanta HQ, executives reportedly locked themselves in boardrooms for emergency risk strategy calls. $890 million in ESG-linked credit was frozen in one sweep. Meanwhile, Alyssa opened her laptop to a new email thread. "Senate Ethics Response Draft the Reed Amendment. It proposed making the youth equity platform not just a nonprofit, but a federally integrated system. All commercial airlines, to retain their federal certification, would be required to implement passenger youth rights cards, quarterly third-party ethics audits, immediate response protocol for minor mistreatment. Emmanuel's voice had now become a legislative signature. But at home, things didn't feel so large. Not to Emmanuel. He still took out the trash, still struggled with long division, still worried about the kid from Ohio who wrote him again, this time saying her mom had been detained at another airport. He showed the letter to Patricia. She said it happened again. Same gate, different city. Patricia didn't say, "We'll fix it." Instead, she said, "Let's shine light on it." They published the story, with the girl's consent, on the platform's new ongoing harm tracker. The page now listed real-time stories of youth discrimination as reported. It gained more traffic in a day than the main platform homepage. That night, Emmanuel sat with a notebook. He wasn't drawing Lego towers or courtrooms. He was listing names. Kids who had written him. Kids who shared stories. Kids who signed with hearts or stars or first initials. He looked up and asked Patricia, "What if we made something for them?" "Like what?" "A wall, a virtual one. That remembers their names. Like a monument." Patricia teared up. "You mean like a memorial?" "No," Emmanuel said. "A reminder that they mattered, even if no one else believed them." By week's end, the site added a new section, the Wall of Voices. It wasn't flashy, just names, initials, locations, ages, one scrollable column after another. But users began leaving messages under the names. "Same thing happened to me. Stay strong. I see you." Soon, families began writing in, asking to add more names. Children who had passed away, or been silenced, or still afraid. A grandmother added her grandson's name, saying, "He died before the law changed, but I think he'd be proud of you." On the following Monday, Patricia received a private request from the FAA chair herself. Would Emmanuel be willing to serve as honorary advisor to the upcoming Airline Passenger Equity Framework? Patricia stared at the message, then turned to Emmanuel. He looked up from a book of civil rights cases. "Do I get to tell them when they're wrong?" "Yes." Then yes. That night, the three of them, Patricia, Emmanuel, and Alyssa, sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The headlines were loud, the networks kept calling, but for a moment, there was just wind and porch light, and quiet. Emmanuel leaned his head on Patricia's shoulder. "Is it over?" he asked. She thought for a while. "No," she said, "but we've changed the starting line for everyone else." He nodded. "I'm okay with that." And in the dim light, the boy who had once quoted laws to defend a stranger sat still, no longer afraid of the weight he carried, because now he knew he wasn't carrying it alone. The hearing room was silent. Every chair in the gallery was filled. Senators lined the long arc of the dais. Cameras from every major network panned slowly, waiting for the moment. Then the gavel dropped. "Committee will come to order," the chairwoman said, and Emmanuel Reed, 8 years old, dressed in a simple navy jacket and clip-on tie, rose from his seat. No prepared remarks, just a page with names from the Wall of Voices. He placed it beside the microphone, then looked straight into the room. "My name is Emmanuel Reed," he said. "I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a politician, I'm a kid who got hurt." He paused. "But I'm not just here because someone hit me. I'm here because no one stopped them." The silence deepened. He went on, steady but clear. "They looked at me and saw a problem. They looked at my mom and saw a threat. They didn't ask questions, they just moved us like bags." A few people shifted in their chairs. Emmanuel continued, "But I read your rules. I read the FAA guidelines. I read your ethics charter. You say you protect passengers." He held up the guidelines. "But you didn't protect me." The senators leaned in. The youngest witness ever to testify before a federal aviation ethics hearing was making the room listen. Emmanuel wasn't shaking. He wasn't smiling. He was carrying the weight of 147 stories behind him, and he knew it. "There's a boy named Lucas on the wall of voices," he said, voice tightening. "He was 10. His mom had a speech delay. They were kicked off a plane because the gate agent said she was being disrespectful. She wasn't. She just needed more time to talk." He looked down briefly, then back up. "Lucas wrote to me. Said he cried the whole flight back home. Said he stopped talking for a month." Gasps echoed softly through the room. Emmanuel didn't blink. Lucas deserved better, and so do all of us. From the back row, Patricia sat still. Alyssa gripped her hand, jaw clenched, tears burning behind her glasses. She remembered how small he'd looked that night. Now, he looked like he belonged behind that microphone. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Mr. Reed," she said gently, "you mentioned the FAA Ethics Charter. In your view, what should be changed?" Emmanuel nodded. "Make it law, not suggestion. And if airlines break it, they lose funding, lose routes, lose trust." Someone murmured, "He's 8?" Another senator added, "He's right." The moment turned. What started as a symbolic hearing, a pat on the head for the viral kid with big words, was shifting. Emmanuel wasn't just retelling a story, he was shaping federal policy. The next day, the Reed Amendment passed committee vote 13-1. It advanced to the Senate floor with bipartisan backing. Under the proposal, the ClearEquity score would become mandatory at all federally linked airports. Any airline with 3 consecutive violations against minors or disabled passengers would face a 72-hour grounding. A permanent youth passenger ombudsman office would be formed. It was the first aviation reform in decades written in direct response to a child's testimony. And it didn't stop there. Within a week, 5 more airlines voluntarily signed onto the ethics accord, before the vote was even finalized. Emmanuel's speech had gone viral again. Only this time, the headlines weren't about the slap. They were about solutions. But back home, the world remained quiet. After the hearing, Emmanuel asked if they could go to the library. Not for law books, for comic books. He sat on the floor between the shelves, shoes half untied, flipping through old Avengers issues. The librarian peeked in. "You're that boy, aren't you?" He looked up. "I guess so." She smiled softly. "Thank you." He didn't know what to say, so he smiled back and kept reading. That night, as clouds rolled in over Atlanta, Patricia stood in the hallway outside Emmanuel's room. He was asleep, book on his chest, nightlight glowing softly. For the first time in weeks, he looked like a kid again. She exhaled and allowed herself to believe it might stay that way for a little while longer. The morning light poured through the window like honey. Emmanuel sat at the kitchen table, one hand curled around a mug of warm milk, the other scribbling quietly in his notebook. He wasn't writing laws or speeches this time. He was drawing superheroes, ones that looked like kids in wheelchairs, kids with glasses, kids with scars. Heroes that looked like him. "What you working on?" Alyssa asked, walking in with her laptop tucked under her arm. Emmanuel looked up. "A new team." She raised an eyebrow. "Avengers who file lawsuits?" He grinned. "More like defenders of passengers' rights." She laughed and tousled his hair. Later that afternoon, Patricia stepped into the living room holding a box, a dusty one. "Found this in the attic," she said, setting it on the coffee table. "Thought you might want to see." Inside were old clippings, journals, and photos from her early years as an ESG advisor. Emmanuel leafed through them, eyes widening. "You had to fight this too?" Patricia nodded. "Different shape, same battle." He held up a photo of her in front of a city board meeting. "You were fierce," he whispered. "I still am," she smiled. The knock on the door came just after dinner. A courier. White envelope. Government seal. Alyssa opened it, then froze. "What is it?" Patricia asked. She handed over the paper with trembling fingers. The president was awarding Emmanuel the National Civil Integrity Medal, the youngest recipient in history. "I don't know if I deserve that," Emmanuel said quietly. Patricia placed a gentle hand on his back. You didn't ask for attention. You asked for change. That's what makes you worthy. He looked down, then nodded. Okay. The ceremony was quiet, dignified. Held in a garden behind the Capitol, it wasn't broadcast, but word still spread. The medal was small, but heavy in his hand. Afterward, the president leaned down and whispered, "The world needs people like you, son. Keep going. But don't forget to be a kid, too." Emmanuel didn't say much, but later that night in his journal he wrote, "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't yelling. It's standing quietly when everyone else looks away." 3 weeks later, a surprise. Skyfront Airlines, yes, the very one from Flight 382117, launched a scholarship in Emmanuel's name. But that wasn't what shocked the public. It was the video that accompanied it. The former flight attendant, Brittany. She sat in a chair, facing the camera, face bare, voice steady. "I was wrong," she said. "I was trained to look at differences as threats. I should have looked at them as people." She apologized to Emmanuel, to Alyssa, to Patricia. "I hope someday," she said, voice cracking, "your family can forgive me. I'm learning how to be better." They watched the clip at home in silence. Alyssa turned to Patricia. "What do we even say?" Patricia looked at Emmanuel. He thought for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know if I forgive her yet, but I believe her." That night, they sat together on the porch, fireflies blinking in the yard. "What now?" Alyssa asked softly. Patricia smiled. "Now? Now we build." And Emmanuel added, "Now we make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." He looked up at the stars. They were still far away, but somehow they didn't feel out of reach. The basement of their home had never been more alive. Stacks of papers, rolls of blueprints, sticky notes across every wall. In the center, Emmanuel sat with a laptop open, eyes darting between tabs of legal codes and diagrams. Next to him, Alyssa clicked through an early mock-up. On screen, a system that looked like flight booking, but with something new. A score. Next to each airline, a badge marked ClearEquity Compliant. "This is it," Alyssa said. "The dashboard lives here. Simple, visible, undeniable." Emmanuel nodded. They can't hide behind policies anymore. They were building the first real-time public interface for aviation ethics scores, a tool passengers could see before buying tickets. And it wasn't just an app. It was accountability. Patricia entered with fresh tea, looking both proud and exhausted. "I just got off the call with the FAA. They're ready." Alyssa sat up. "For pilot trials?" "No," Patricia said. "For full implementation. 3 airports, 32 gates, 2 weeks." Emmanuel's eyes widened. "They're actually doing it?" Patricia smiled, slow and quiet. "They are." In those 2 weeks, the family barely slept. They launched a pilot version of the platform under the name Open Skies Ethics Board, a nonprofit initiative, funded in part by donations from advocacy groups and civil rights organizations. Airlines were hesitant, some resisted. But when 3 major influencers posted about the tool, and over 1 million users downloaded it in 48 hours, resistance crumbled. Then came the moment of validation. A mother in Denver, traveling with her son on the spectrum, changed her booking last minute after seeing a low ethics score. She wrote a message to the team. "Thank you. For once, I felt seen before something went wrong." Emmanuel read it 3 times, then forwarded it to everyone on the team with one line. "This is why." By month's end, 11 more airlines had voluntarily opted in. ClearEquity wasn't just a back-end compliance report anymore. It was a choice, a signal to passengers. "We see you, we care." Media outlets flooded in. First CNN, then the Wall Street Journal, then an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "The 8-year-old Who Changed How We Fly." But inside the Reed home, the attention wasn't the goal. The work was. One night, Alyssa asked Emmanuel, "Do you ever wish none of it had happened?" He paused, then shrugged. "Sometimes. But if it didn't, maybe nothing would have changed." He looked at her, serious. I still wish it didn't happen to me, but I'm glad it happened to someone who could fight back. The next morning, a large envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a letter. It was from Brittany. Not a lawyer-written statement, just handwriting, honest and a little shaky. She'd enrolled in an airline ethics and trauma recovery program. She said she'd started volunteering at a community center for foster youth. And then she wrote, "You gave me a second chance. I intend to make it count." Emmanuel folded the letter, put it inside a small binder labeled "Change," and he smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time it felt like the system was listening. The sun rose slowly over Washington, D.C., bathing the marble steps of the Capitol in soft gold. Inside the Grand Rotunda, rows of chairs were filled with faces from every part of the nation. Lawmakers, activists, airline executives, families who'd lived through moments like Emmanuel's. And at the front stood a plaque, draped in navy blue cloth. Emmanuel adjusted the collar of his white shirt. Alyssa straightened his tie. Patricia rested a hand on his shoulder. "You ready, counselor?" she whispered. He nodded, small, steady. A senator stepped up to the podium. In our country's history, there are moments when a single voice, small but clear, shifts the course of how we treat each other. She turned. And sometimes, that voice is just 8 years old. The room laughed gently, then hushed. "With this vote," she continued, "the Passenger Ethics Enforcement Act becomes law." Applause broke. Not the explosive kind, the kind that carries respect. When they unveiled the plaque, Emmanuel didn't speak right away. He just stared. His name wasn't at the top. It wasn't in bold. It was at the bottom. Small, almost hidden. But it read, "In honor of those who choose justice over silence." He stepped forward, then turned to the crowd. "I didn't ask to be part of this," Emmanuel said. His voice was soft, but clear. "I just didn't want it to happen again." He paused. "My grandma always says, the system is just a bunch of people who forgot how to care." A few nods. He smiled slightly. "I think we helped them remember." Outside, reporters gathered on the steps, but Emmanuel didn't stop. He just kept walking, past cameras and questions, his hand holding Alyssa's tightly. They walked through the city that had passed a law in his name, not for recognition, but because it was right. That night, back home in Chicago, the kitchen smelled like warm cookies. Emmanuel sat at the counter, his chin in one hand, doodling in his notebook again. Not superheroes this time, just ordinary people, smiling, welcoming, kind. Patricia came over, sliding a fresh batch from the oven. "Heard anything about the ethics score rollout?" she asked. Alyssa looked up from her phone. 17 more airports signed on, including O'Hare. Patricia whistled. "That's half the country." "No," Emmanuel said softly. "That's just the start." Later, before bed, Emmanuel stepped onto the balcony. Stars blinked in the sky. A quiet wind passed through. He looked up and whispered, not to anyone in particular, "Thank you, God." Not because he was done, but because he wasn't alone anymore. What would you have done if that was your child on the plane? Have you ever witnessed injustice in public and said nothing? Tell us where you're watching from, and if you think more airlines need something like ClearEquity today, and if you believe every voice, no matter how small, deserves to be heard. Don't forget to share this story.